Big or small, left or right, the state is evil. Each and every person who advocates government in any form, whether liberal, conservative, moderate, independent, communist, fascist, constitutionalist, or any other flavor, believes that representatives of authority on a large scale commit acts of which, if done by anyone else, would be widely recognized as unjust and immoral. All statists believe that the people who make up government have an exemption from basic human morality and not only may do things which others have no right to do, but should and must do things for the supposed good of society. The type and degree of aggression varies, but all statists advocate aggression. In statist mythology, the political left and the political right wing are opposites. In reality, they are two sides of the same coin. The difference lies only in what the different voters hope those in power will do with that power. But in practice, left and right politicians all engage in wealth redistribution, warmongering, central control of commerce, and numerous coercive restrictions upon the behavior of their subjects. As right wing and left wing statists approach complete power, they are utterly distinguishable from each other. Hitler's supposedly far right regime and Stalin's supposedly far left regime were virtually identical. Whether the original stated purpose of either, the end result was complete power and control for the politicians and complete helplessness and enslavement of everyone else. Being allowed to choose between the political left and the political right provides the people with exactly as much power and freedom as allowing them to choose between death by hanging and death by firing squad. And adding an independent third party only adds the option of death by electrocution as long as the people bicker about which gang should enslave everyone, known as democracy, the people will remain enslaved. Ironically, statists of all political stripes lament the influence that lobbyists and special interests have over politicians, ignoring the fact that every voter is a special interest, every campaign contributor is a lobbyist. Once people accept the premise that government has the right to forcibly micromanage society, perpetual competition between groups, each throwing money and favors at politicians to buy to get their way, is inevitable. It is silly to advocate authoritarian control, government, only to then complain about the unavoidable effect of authoritarian control, people trying to buy influence. Politicians can be bought only because they have the power to sell. And they have the power to sell only because people believe in government. State power will always be used to serve one person's agenda at the expense of another. How else could coercion be used? Making the idea of government corruption redundant. Every statist wants government to forcibly impose his will on others, but doubts it corruption, but dubs it corruption if someone else's agenda wins out. The hypocrisy is astonishing. Likewise, conservative pundits on talk radio and elsewhere sanctimoniously characterize liberals for advocating forced wealth redistribution, while the pundits do exactly the same thing for slightly different purposes. To criticize welfare while supporting corporate subsidies, or to criticize attempts to legislate fairness while supporting the war on drugs, or to criticize liberal plans to nationalize industry while supporting a giantly forcibly funded government military, which amounts to rationalizing the protection nationalize which amounts to nationalizing the protection industry, shows a complete absence of philosophical principles. At the same time, it is equally hypocritical for liberals to righteously condemn right-wing warmongering while supporting a giant, intrusive, vicious extortion racket taxation, or to complain about the intolerance of the right while advocating all manner of authoritarian behavioral controls. in truth, there is no real difference between the philosophical principles of one status and another, because they both accept the premise that a ruling class with the right to control and rob the population is necessary and legitimate. The only argument after that one is not one of principle, but simply a debate over how the loot should be distributed and what choices should be forced upon the peasants. There is no such thing as a tolerant liberal or a tolerant conservative, because not one of them tolerates people spending their own money and controlling their own lives. It is true that the degree of evil and types of immoral aggression advocated vary based upon the different styles of statism. Constitutionalists, for example, advocate relatively low levels of robbery and extortion, taxation, and advocate that only certain, limited activities and behaviors should be controlled via threats and coercion regulation. But every power which any constitution pretends to grant to any legislature is a power not possessed by mere mortal individuals who who would bother writing into a constitution a line pretending to delegate a certain people a right already possessed by everyone else. All such grants of power and any document purporting to create a government or empower any legislature to do anything are attempts to issue a license to commit evil. However, as should be patently self-evident, no person or group of people, regardless of what documents they create or rituals they perform, can grant to someone else moral permission to commit evil. And putting supposed limits on such permission does not make it any more sane or legitimate. In short, to advocate government is always to advocate evil. Liberals and conservatives both insist that someone needs to be in charge, because that is the reality they were raised in. The only thing required of them was that they remain obedient to authority. From that training, they have little or no idea what to do if left to their own devices, if no one is telling them what to do. So, they refuse to grow up and to hallucinate into existence a superhuman authority. Paradoxically, even though there is no earthly species above human beings, they seek to fabricate this superhuman entity out of nothing but human beings, and then try to bestow upon it superhuman qualities, rights, and virtues. The entire concept is delusional, but it is shared by the vast majority of people the world over who refuse to accept the fact that there is no shortcut to determining right and wrong. There is no magic trick which will make truth and injustice automatically prevail. There is no system that can guarantee safety or fairness, and that everyday mortal human beings, with all of their deficiencies and shortcomings, are the best and only hope for civilization. There is no tooth fairy or Santa Claus or magical entity called government which can make an immoral species behave morally or make a group of imperfect people function perfectly. And the belief in such an entity, rather than being merely pointless and ineffective, drastically increases the overall stupidity, conflict, injustice, intolerance, violence, oppression, and murder in human society. Nonetheless, most of those indoctrinated into the worship of government would rather cling to their familiar, horribly destructive, heinously evil, profoundly anti-human superstitions than grow up and accept the fact that there is no one above them, there is no giant mommy or daddy to save the day. They are at the top, and each of them is personally responsible for deciding what he should do and then doing it. Sadly, they would rather suffer the hell of perpetual war and total enslavement than face the uncertainty and responsibility that comes with freedom. The belief in authority negates and overrides nearly all of the positive effects of religious and moral beliefs. What most people call their religion is empty window dressing, and what most people tout as their moral virtue is irrelevant as long as they believe in the myth of authority. Christians, for example, are taught such things as, if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. Love your neighbor, and even love your enemy, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Yet, every so-called Christian who believes in government constantly forsakes these principles, advocating constant aggression against everyone, friend, enemy, neighbor, and stranger, via the cult of government, to put on a show of being religious, compassionate, loving, and virtuous, while voting for a gang that promises to use violence to control the actions of everyone you know is the height of hypocrisy. To refrain from personally robbing one's neighbor while pushing for someone else to do it is both cowardly and hypocritical. Yet, almost every Christian and every member of every other religion does such things on a regular basis by way of political advocacy. As mentioned before, faith in government is purely a religious belief. As such, the vast majority of those who wear the label atheist are not actually atheists, because they believe in the God called government. They do not recognize it as a religious belief, of course, but their belief that a superhuman savior of mankind authority is a deep and faith-based as any other religious belief. Ironically, atheists are often quick to point out the destruction that has been committed throughout history in the name of religion, but fail to notice the gruesome results of the God they bow to, government. The atheists are absolutely right to point out that when churches were, were the accepted authority, the organizations thought to have the right to forcibly control others, many of them committed large-scale heinous acts of terrorism, torture, and murder. But what most modern atheists fail to realize, despite the clear evidence staring them right in the face, is that they are members of the most destructive church in history, the Church of Government, which has managed to wreak havoc, death, and destruction on a level far beyond what even the most vicious churches of the past did. For example, over the span of 200 years, around 1 or 2 million people were killed in the religious wars known as the Crusades. In comparison, in half that time, in the 20th century, 100 times as many people were killed by the progressive policies of collectivist governments. Advances in technology no doubt played a large role in the increase in deaths, but the point is, whether the mask of authority is worn by the church or a state, the superstition is horribly dangerous and the results horribly destructive. The fact that so many atheists eagerly condemn one form of superstition while vehemently advocating in another form shows an amazing degree of selective blindness. Often those most critical of oppression via religion are some of the most devout, true believers in the God called government.